Morning fog. The fog had come in heavy that morning, thick enough to soften the sharp edges of Boston's skyline and muffle the noise of the waking city. The Charles River moved slowly under its gray shroud, carrying a reflection of dim street lamps that still burned against the early dawn. It was the kind of morning that made the world feel paused, as if nothing urgent could happen until the sun decided to break through. On the far edge of the public garden, an old wooden bench sat facing the water. The pain had long since surrendered to time, leaving the wood bare and smooth under countless strangers' hands. To most, it was an unremarkable seat in an unremarkable park. But to Robin Williams, it was different. This was the bench. He had sat here years ago, filming a scene that would go on to be called one of the most moving in cinema history. Back then, it was lit by a camera crew, his words scripted, his every movement captured for the screen. But this morning, there were no cameras, no makeup artists, no lines to memorize, just Robin, a paper coffee cup cooling in his hands, and the sound of the river breathing against the banks. He wore a dark knit cap, pulled low against the chill, a warm brown jacket zipped halfway. His posture was slightly hunched, not from age, but from the quiet kind of fatigue that comes from carrying too much of the world on your shoulders. From a distance, no one would guess that this was the same man whose voice had once filled stadiums with laughter. And that was exactly the way he wanted it. The park was nearly empty. A jogger passed without recognition, earbuds shutting out the world. A couple walked their dog along the winding path, the leash swaying between them. Robin stayed still, his gaze somewhere far past the water, in a place only he could see. If someone had asked him what he was thinking, he might not have been able to say. It was a single thought, but a collage, moments flashing in no particular order. His children's faces, the way the lights felt when the curtain first rose, the sound of applause that still rang in his bones, and threaded through it all, the quiet ache of knowing that for all the joy he had given, there were parts of himself no one had ever truly known. Somewhere behind him, footsteps began to approach. They were slow, uneven, not the brisk stride of a commuter, nor the light rhythm of a jogger. There was weight in them, the kind you couldn't see but could feel. Robin didn't turn. Not yet. He took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the moment. The footsteps drew closer, then paused, as if the person was unsure whether to continue. He felt it, that hesitation, and somehow knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary morning. The fog shifted, curling around them like a curtain. And before the day was over, a conversation would unfold on this bench that neither of them would ever forget, a conversation that, for one man, might just mean the difference between giving up and holding on. The stranger. The footsteps started again, slow and deliberate, the sound of rubber soles meeting damp pavement. Robin didn't turn immediately. Years in the public eye had taught him that people approached in two distinct ways, either with the unrestrained excitement of recognition or with a heavy, uncertain pace of someone carrying a weight they couldn't name. This was the second kind. Through the thin veil of fog, a figure emerged, mid to late 30s, shoulders slightly slumped, eyes fixed not on Robin but on the bench itself, as if it would carry some kind of gravitational pull. His clothes were the kind that had stopped caring, a wrinkled button down, dark jeans that hadn't seen a wash in a week, a jacket zipped only halfway. When the man finally looked up, recognition flickered across his face, but it wasn't followed by the usual spark of, "Oh my God, you're Robin Williams." Instead, his expression softened into something else, something closer to relief and fear. "Mr. Williams?" The voice was low, almost testing the name to see if it still belonged to the man in front of him. Robin gave a small nod, a warm but measured smile crossing his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's just Robin, though. Sit if you want." The man hesitated for a moment, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, before lowering himself onto the bench. The wood groaned under the shared weight. They sat with a small gap between them, both looking straight ahead at the slow-moving river, neither in a rush to fill the silence. Finally, the man spoke. I don't want to take up your time. I know you're probably here to be alone." His voice cracked slightly, betraying a nervous tremor. "But I lost my wife last year, and I don't know how to live without her." Robin didn't turn his head, but his eyes shifted toward him, catching the faint reflection of pain in the stranger's face. He let the words hang in the cold air for a moment before answering. "You know," Robin said slowly, "people think because I make them laugh, I must always have the answers. But I've been where you are, maybe not in the same way, but I've known what it's like to feel like the color's been drained out of the world." The man's hands tightened together in his lap. "Everyone keeps telling me it'll get better. That time will heal it. But it's been a year," and his voice trailed off into the sound of the water lapping against the embankment. "I wake up and it's just empty." Robin took a slow sip of his coffee, buying a moment to choose his words. He knew this was one of those conversations that didn't need quick fixes or platitudes. What it needed was truth, and truth, he had learned, was best delivered gently, like handing someone a fragile object you didn't want them to drop. "The thing about grief," Robin said quietly, "is that it doesn't go away. People like to say it does, but they're lying. What happens is you learn to carry it differently. At first, it's so heavy you can barely stand. But one day, without realizing it, you'll carry it without breaking. It'll still be there, but you'll be stronger." The man's breathing slowed, as if each word was settling into him. They sat there for another long stretch of silence, the fog curling around them like a cocoon. Somewhere in the distance, the faint honk of a car horn reminded them that the rest of the city was still moving, still alive, still unaware of what was unfolding on this bench. Robin knew they weren't done talking. He could feel there was more the man needed to say, and more he needed to hear. But for now, it was enough to sit, two strangers bound by the same unspoken truth. Sometimes, the most important conversations in life don't start with a question. They start with the courage to sit down. The conversation. The fog hung low over the Charles, swallowing the far bank in a pale blur. The park felt sealed off from the rest of Boston, as if this one stretch of bench and river existed in its own suspended world. Here, time moved differently, slower, softer, yet charged with something unspoken. Robin turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands, letting the paper edge warm his fingertips. He had been in countless interviews, thousands of conversations, but this one felt different. This wasn't about entertainment or a clever soundbite or a laugh that could be coaxed in under 3 seconds. This was about a man whose life had cracked open and who had stumbled into this morning not knowing if he could keep walking through it. The stranger drew in a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "She was everything," he began, not in the cliché way people say that. "I mean, she was the one who made things make sense. Without her," his voice faltered, a brittle edge creeping into it. "Without her, it's like someone took the map away, and I'm just wandering." Robin didn't rush to answer. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, watching the slow movement of the water. "When I lost someone I loved," he said carefully, "people kept telling me to stay busy." He gave a short, humorless laugh, as if distraction is the same thing as healing. The man's gaze stayed on the river, but Robin could see him listening, really listening. "I think," Robin continued, "we treat grief like it's an enemy we have to outlast. But it's not going anywhere. It's going to live with you now. And you get to decide whether it's going to be a chain around your neck or something you carry in your pocket. Something small enough to hold, but never lose." The man blinked, his jaw tightening. "How do you make it smaller?" Robin let the question breathe. "You find the pieces of her you can still carry," he said softly. "The things that made her laugh. The words she'd use when you were being an idiot. The places you went together. You keep those alive. In your actions, in your kindness, in your laughter. And when you do that, she's not gone. Not completely." For a moment, the only sound was the faint lap of the river against the bank. Then the man's shoulders shook, not with sobs, but with the quiet release of someone who'd been holding too much for too long. Robin didn't reach over right away. He let the silence hold them, because he knew it was part of the conversation too. Finally, he said, "The thing about laughter, it doesn't erase the pain, but sometimes it makes the weight shift just enough so you can stand up again." The man turned to look at him fully for the first time, and in his eyes was something raw, gratitude mixed with disbelief. "I don't know why you're sitting here right now," he said, his voice breaking. but I think I needed you more than I've needed anyone in a long time." Robin smiled, not the broad, manic grin the world knew, but a small, steady smile that came from somewhere deep. Then I guess we both showed up where we were supposed to be. Somewhere far off, the city carried on. Taxis weaving through traffic, shop doors unlocking, lives unfolding. But here, on this bench, in this moment, two men had carved out a space where the noise couldn't reach. And neither of them knew it yet, but this would not be the last time they thought about this morning. The shift, the fog had begun to thin, revealing more of the riverbank on the opposite side. A few early joggers appeared on the distant path, their silhouettes moving like shadows that hadn't quite caught up with the day. The air was still damp, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and the metallic tang of the Charles. On the bench, something imperceptible had shifted. The stranger's shoulders, once pulled tight toward his chest, had eased down by a fraction. His breathing, once shallow, now moved slower, steadier, like a man who had been holding his head underwater and had just broken the surface for a gulp of air. Robin noticed. He'd spent a lifetime reading people, audiences, co-stars, strangers at a bus stop. He knew when someone was putting on a mask, and he knew when it slipped. And right now, the mask was gone. The man stared out of the water, voice low. "You know what's strange? I've had people talk to me for hours since she died, but I don't think anyone has actually sat with me. Not like this. They all want to fix me or distract me or avoid me altogether. You're the first person who's just here." Robin tilted his head, considering that. "Most people are afraid of other people's pain," he said. "It makes them feel helpless. And when they feel helpless, they say things that aren't really about you. They're about making themselves feel better." He paused, a faint, self-aware smile flickering on his lips. "I've been guilty of that, too. Sometimes I tell jokes because I don't know what else to do." The man looked over, curiosity in his eyes. "And what about now? Why aren't you telling jokes?" Robin turned his gaze back to the river. "Because you don't need to laugh right this second. You need to feel heard. And sometimes that's the only thing that keeps someone from drowning." For a moment, the stranger didn't speak. He simply let the words settle, like stones sinking to the bottom of the river. Then he asked the question Robin had known was coming. "How did you get through it? Whoever was you lost. How did you keep going?" Robin's breath caught almost imperceptibly. Memories flickered. Moments he rarely spoke of in interviews, moments the cameras never caught. The hollow quiet of certain nights. The loneliness that could creep in even when he was surrounded by people. The people he'd lost, some the time, some the choice, and some the battles they couldn't win. "I didn't get through it right away," he said finally. "Some days I still don't. But I learned to stop trying to outrun it. I let it walk beside me. Some days it's quiet. Some days it's loud. But it's part of me now. And the strange thing is, once I stopped fighting it, I started noticing the moments where I could feel joy again. Not big, explosive joy, just small ones. Like this one right now, sitting here." The man's eyes searched Robin's face, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. And in that moment, something loosened in the stranger, not because the grief was gone, but because he realized it might be possible to live alongside it. Above them, the fog continued to lift, revealing a paler sky. Life in the park picked up pace. The rustle of leaves as a dog ran past, the crunch of gravel under a cyclist's tires. But on the bench, the air felt different. For the first time in a long time, the stranger didn't feel like he was walking alone. And Robin, though he would never say out loud, felt the same. The unspoken parallel. The park had grown busier, but the bench still felt like its own quiet island. Conversations floated by on a breeze, fragment of laughter, the bark of a dog, the crisp rustle of newspaper pages. But none of it pierced the bubble that had formed between the two men. Robin sat back, crossing one leg over the other, his coffee now empty but still cradled in his hands. He had said things in the last half hour that he rarely voiced. They had come naturally, almost without thinking, but he could feel the echo of them now, reverberating in his chest. Because the truth was, Every word he'd offered to the stranger was a truth he needed to hear himself. The man broke the silence first. "You talk like you've been there, like you still go there sometimes." Robin smiled faintly. "I do, more than people think." His gaze drifted toward the water, the reflections of buildings rippling in distorted shapes. "The world thinks I live in this constant state of joy, because that's what I give them. But I've had days where just getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain." The man turned toward him, surprise in his eyes. "But you're Robin Williams. You made millions of people laugh. You've got everything." Robin gave a small laugh, but it carried no real humor. That's the funny thing about everything. It's never as complete as it looks from the outside. You can have crowds cheering your name and still feel like you're sitting in an empty room. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You lost your wife. I've lost people, too. Friends, mentors, pieces of myself along the way. And sometimes the hardest part isn't the loss itself. It's pretending you're fine so you don't scare people away." The man nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, everyone wants me to be better already. Like grief has an expiration date." Robin's voice softened. "It doesn't. It just changes shape. Some days it's a shadow you barely notice. Some days it's a storm that knocks you off your feet. But you keep walking, and over time, you realize the storm doesn't stay forever." There was a pause, the kind where two people are no longer strangers but not yet friends. Something in between, something forged in sheer vulnerability. Robin could feel the weight of his own battles pressing at the edges of the moment. He thought about the nights when the world felt unbearably heavy, about the times when his own mind turned against him, whispering doubts, feeding the darkness. He thought about how easy it would be to hide behind humor, and how much harder it was to speak like this, openly, plainly, without the armor of a joke. In the stranger's eyes, he saw something achingly familiar. The look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure if they had the strength to step back. And maybe, Robin thought, that's why he had come to this bench today. Maybe this conversation wasn't just for the man beside him. Maybe it was for him too. The river flowed on, indifferent to the lives unfolding on its banks. Above them, the sun finally began to pierce through the thinning fog, spilling a muted gold across the water. It was the first sign of light that morning, and for both men it felt like a promise, fragile but real. The parting gift. The sun had broken through just enough to turn the river from steel gray to a muted silver. The park was no longer empty. A group of school children passed by in a flurry of chatter. An elderly man tossed crumbs to a pair of ducks gliding near the shore. Life had returned to the public garden. But on the bench, the two men remained in the same stillness they'd built together. Robin glanced at the stranger beside him. The man's posture had changed, not dramatically, but enough to notice. His shoulders were less hunched, his jaw less clenched. The lines of strain across his forehead had softened. It was as if the conversation had loosened a knot that had been tightening for months. Robin set his empty coffee cup on the ground and turned slightly toward him. "You know," he began, "people think the big moments are what keep you going. The career milestones, the huge life changes, the fireworks. But it's not. It's the little stuff. The laugh you weren't expecting. The sunrise you almost missed. The cup of coffee that's somehow better than the one you had yesterday." The man gave a faint, incredulous smile. "And you think those little things can fix this?" Robin shook his head gently. "Not fix. Nothing can fix what happened. But those moments can give you enough light to make it to the next one. And then the next. That's how you keep walking." A silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was a kind of quiet that feels like a deep breath. Robin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn note card. The edges were bent, the ink slightly faded. He held it out. "Here, keep this." The man hesitated before taking it. On one side, in neat handwriting, was a single sentence. "Find something to laugh about today, especially if it's small." The man looked up confused. "You carry this around?" Robin chuckled softly. "I give them out sometimes, or I keep them for myself. Depends on the day." He leaned back, hands in his jacket pockets again. Promise me you'll try it. Just one thing today. Doesn't have to be much. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe it's barely worth noticing. But find it. The man stared at the words for a long moment, then nodded. I promise. They both stood. Robin extended his hand, and the man shook it. Not the quick, polite clasp with strangers, but the kind that lingers a second longer, as if to say, I see you. As they began to walk in opposite directions, Robin called over his shoulder, and hey, if you find something funny enough, laugh out loud. Even if people stare, especially if people stare. The man smiled as he walked away, the note card gripped tightly in his hand. He didn't know it yet, but before the day was over, he would laugh, a real, unforced laugh. For the first time in a year, Robin kept walking along the path, disappearing into the sunlight and the movement of the city. For him, it was just one more quiet moment of connection. For the man on the bench, it was a turning point. Neither of them would ever forget it. The echo years later. It was August 11th, 2014. The day began like any other. The hum of the coffee maker in a small Boston kitchen. The low rumble of the morning news on TV. The man, now in his early 40s, was leaning against a counter when the anchor's voice shifted in tone. We have breaking news. Actor and comedian Robin Williams has died at the age of 63. The mug slipped from his hand, hitting the counter with a dull thud before rolling onto its side. The words didn't seem real. He waited for correction, the false report disclaimer, the reassurance that it was just another internet hoax. But it didn't come. The anchor kept talking about his career, his awards, the millions he had made laugh. The man didn't hear any of it. He was already somewhere else. Back to the bench. In his mind, he was back in the public garden, sitting on that weathered bench, the fog curling around him like a curtain. He could still hear Robin's voice, softer than the one the world knew, stripped of performance, speaking truths that had lodged themselves deep inside him. Find something to laugh about today, especially if it's small. He'd kept that note card. It was still in his wallet. The edges now more frayed, the ink faded to a bluish gray. He had carried it every day since that morning, pulling it out in moments when the weight of life felt like too much. The ripple effect. In the years since that conversation, the man had remarried. He'd become a father. He'd learned to live with the memory of his first wife, not as an open wound, but as a quiet presence woven into the fabric of his days. And through it all, he had kept Robin's promise. Some days, the laugh came easily, his daughter's unrestrained giggle, a bad joke told by a friend. Other days, it was harder to find, but he always looked. And every time he laughed, really laughed, he thought of that morning, of the man who had sat with him, not as a celebrity, not as a performer, but as a human being willing to share his time, his silence, and his understanding. Hearing the news. Now, standing in his kitchen with the morning light spilling across the floor, he felt the loss hit him in a way he hadn't expected. The world had lost Robin Williams, the icon, the legend, but he had lost something different. He had lost the man on the bench. He walked into the living room, sat down, and pulled out his wallet. The note card was still there. He held it in his hands for a long moment before whispering, "Thank you, Robin, for that day and for every day after." The quiet tribute. That afternoon, he took a walk to the public garden. The bench was covered in flowers, photos, and handwritten notes from strangers who had loved Robin in their own way. He added his own, not flowers, not a picture, just a note card. He set it gently on the seat, anchored by a small stone, the words still visible. Find something to laugh about today, especially if it's small. As he stepped back, the breeze off the river lifted the corner of the card. For a split second, it almost looked like it was waving goodbye. The day the world went quiet, the news spread faster than the morning sun. By noon, it had reached every corner of the globe, from Hollywood soundstages to small-town diners, from crowded subways to lonely apartments where a television played softly in the background. Robin Williams was gone. For hours, the world seemed to hum at a lower frequency, as if the laughter had been siphoned out of the air. Social media overflowed with movie clips, stand-up routines, late-night interviews. People quoted lines that had shaped their childhoods, comforted them in heartbreak, or made them believe in something again. Others shared personal stories. The time Robin visited a hospital ward in secret, the charity benefits where he slipped in without announcement, the quiet phone calls he made to strangers battling illness. It wasn't just the work people mourned. It was the man, the bench that spoke without words. In Boston, the public garden transformed into something it had never been before. The weathered bench where he had once delivered a movie's most tender lines became an altar. Flowers piled high. Candles flickered in the twilight. Messages scrawled on scraps of paper, napkins, even ticket stubs whispered the same sentiment in 100 different ways. You mattered. And among those offerings sat a small note card, its edges bent, the ink softened from years of being handled. Find something to laugh about today, especially if it's small. No one there knew the story behind it. How, years earlier, Robin had pressed it into the hands of a grieving man, changing the course of his life. But the note didn't need an explanation. In those words, strangers could hear his voice, feel his warmth, and understand what he had stood for. The man who carried the note. The man stood at the edge of the crowd that evening, watching people pause at the bench. Some smiled faintly. Others wiped tears from their cheeks. A young woman knelt to take a photo, her lips silently mouthing the words on the note card. He didn't introduce himself. This moment wasn't about him. It was about the man who had once sat beside him in the fog, refusing to let a stranger face his pain alone. And as the candles burned lower, the man found himself smiling, not the brittle smile of politeness, but the kind that reached his eyes. Somewhere, he thought Robin would like this, not the flowers or the headlines, but the fact that people had come together in laughter and in tears because of the way he had made them feel. The legacy that doesn't fade. When the sun rose the next morning, the world began moving again. The grief didn't vanish, but life insisted on continuing. Children needed breakfast. Buses kept their schedules. Coffee brewed in kitchens everywhere. And in small, unseen ways, Robin's light kept flickering on. A joke shared between co-workers. A stranger's bill paid quietly. A phone call made just to check in. Little things. The kind he believed in. The kind that, if you paid attention, could keep you standing even in the heaviest seasons of life. For the man from the bench, those moments were no longer rare. They were the heartbeat of his days. And every time he noticed one, every time he laughed, especially when it was small, he felt the presence of a man whose voice would never truly fade. Because the day the world went quiet, it didn't lose Robin Williams entirely. It gained 1,000 little echoes of his kindness, carried forward by everyone he'd ever touched. And somewhere, in a place beyond the stage lights, Robin was smiling.